The most terrifying Viking warriors in history began not in the heat of some legendary battlefield, but in the quiet gloom of dawn on a remote island off the coast of Northumbria. Lindisfarne, 793 CE. The sea lay grey and heavy, a mist pressing low over the waves, as monks murmured their morning prayers, voices soft as the tide lapping the shore. Their psalms rose to heaven, fragile in the hush of dawn, when another sound intruded. At first it was faint, a thrum beneath the fog, like the beating of some vast unseen heart. Then it grew thump, 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 an unnatural rhythm that set every creature on the island to unease. Out of the veil of mist, dragon-headed prows burst into view, their carved snouts grinning as though some ancient beast had risen from the sea itself. Longships cut through the shallows, their oars striking water in perfect, relentless unison. The monks froze, robes clutched to their trembling bodies, for what emerged from those ships were men unlike any they had seen before. Some were draped in bear pelts, shaggy hides, bristling with sea spray. Others wore wolf skins, snarling jaws still affixed, the heads of beasts glaring where their own should be. Painted bodies glistened with sweat and salt, their skin scarred in strange patterns, symbols of oaths sworn in blood, their eyes burned with something beyond mortal fury. The first to leap ashore came not upright like men, but charging on all fours, biting their shields until foam gathered at their lips. Their howls split the morning calm, sending birds shrieking into the air. Behind them, others moved with a chilling calmness, wolfish grins fixed on their faces as though they were hunters among prey. To the monks, it was as if nightmares had taken flesh-men beasts that neither iron nor fire could stop. These were not ordinary raiders, hungry for silver and food. They were something far worse. They were the Berserkers and Ulfhednar, the most terrifying Viking warriors in history. To face them was to confront the very boundary between man and beast, to stand before men who had stripped away fear, pain, even humanity itself, and become living weapons of terror. That morning, Lindisfarne was drowned not by tide, but by blood. The psalms ended in screams, the monastery torn apart stone by stone, its treasures looted, its men of God cut down as though nothing more than cattle. The massacre would echo across Europe, etched in trembling ink into the chronicles of Christendom. This was no simple raid, it was the birth of an age. For centuries to come, the word Viking would conjure terror, and at the heart of that terror were these warriors' men who had become more than men. The world had awoken to them at Lindisfarne, and it would never sleep peacefully again. They spoke of men who were not men at all, but beasts in human form, warriors who could stride into battle without fear, without pain, their eyes lit with the frenzy of something otherworldly. To the terrified monks and farmers who saw them, these figures seemed touched by the hand of gods or demons. To their own kin, they were the chosen, warriors who had stepped beyond the realm of ordinary flesh and taken on the mantle of bear and wolf. The Berserkers were the storm. They came roaring, shield edges crushed between their teeth, blood and froth running down their beards as they hurled themselves into the fray. Axes rose and fell with impossible strength, each swing carrying the weight of 10 men. Fire could not turn them back, nor steel slow their charge. They howled like animals, their skin painted, their bodies scarred in patterns of dark ritual. To face them was to face madness made flesh, a frenzy so wild that even allies sometimes shrank from their side. Yet there were others, quieter, no less dreadful. The Ulfhednar, the wolfcoats, who did not fight as frenzied beasts, but as predators with chilling precision. Where the Berserkers raged, they stalked. Moving through shadows, silent but for their howls that echoed across the field, they hunted in packs, striking with sudden violence before vanishing back into the mist. Their wolf pelts marked them as sons of Odin's hunger, and like wolves they tore into their prey with ruthless calculation. It was said both kinds of warriors served the All-Father himself, Odin, god of frenzy and wisdom, ecstasy and death. To fight in his name was to open oneself to forces beyond mortal comprehension. Whether by ritual, by trance, or by secret herbs whispered of in fireside tales, these men shed their human skin and wore the spirit of beasts. The transformation was so complete that those who witnessed it swore they had seen men truly become bears, truly become wolves, their voices no longer human but the cries of the wild. And in their wake, nothing remained but ruin. Villages burned. Armies broke apart, not from wounds of the body, but from wounds of the mind, the sheer terror of facing warriors who could not be stopped by blade or flame. To fight such men was to fight against the very idea of death itself, for how could one kill what no longer seemed human? Thus, the Viking Age carved its terror not only with ships and steel, but with men who chose to abandon humanity altogether. They became beasts, and in doing so, they became the most feared warriors the world had ever known. They called it the Berserker gang, the battle madness that turned men into creatures unrecognizable, their humanity swallowed by a storm that raged from within. It began with a shiver, a trembling that coursed through the limbs as though winter itself had crept under their skin. Then the face would swell, eyes bulging with fire, lips drawn back to bare teeth like a rabid beast. Some would gnaw the rims of their shields until splinters and blood mingled in their mouths. Others would foam and howl so fiercely that even their comrades felt a chill of dread, and then, as if possessed by a god, they would hurl themselves at the enemy. No iron seemed to bite them. Swords broke upon their bodies. Spears thrust deep, yet still they came forward, roaring louder, striking harder. It was said that they felt no pain, that wounds which should have felled a man only drove them deeper into their frenzy. They smashed through shield walls with the strength of bears, tore men apart with the fury of wolves. The battlefield itself seemed to shudder beneath their charge. To face one berserker was to confront the storm. To face a band of them was to watch your world collapse. Even allies feared their presence. In the sagas, it is told that when the fury came, these men could not always tell friend from foe. They were as dangerous to the hand that fed them as to the enemy before them. Yet kings and jarls kept them close, for when loosed at the right moment, no force could stand against them. At Stamford Bridge, at Brunanburh, and in nameless raids along foreign coasts, it was the Berserker gang that broke the line, leaving corpses scattered like driftwood on the tide. Their power was not only of the body, but of the mind. The sight of them foam on their lips, eyes wild, shields bitten through with teeth, struck terror before blades even met. Enemies turned and fled rather than face such madness. For how does one fight a man who has become more beast than flesh? How do you slay a warrior who welcomes the blow of your sword as though it were nothing but wind? And yet, for all their glory, the Berserkers paid a heavy price. When the storm passed, they were left broken, weak, as though the fury had stolen the very life from them. Some collapsed where they stood, trembling like men fevered and spent. Others spoke of no memory of their deeds, as if the rage had consumed not only their strength, but their very souls. Still, they returned again and again to the fury, for within that madness lay their power, their fear, their immortality in the sagas. Thus the Berserker gang became legend, a fury beyond reason, a storm given human form. And in that storm, the line between man and beast was forever lost. They were not the roaring storm like the Berserkers, but the silent terror that moved through the dark. Where the bare-skinned warriors raged in frenzy, the wolf coats the Ulfhednar hunted with patience and cunning. Cloaked in wolf pelts, their faces shadowed by the snarling jaws of beasts, they became creatures of twilight. To see them advancing was to feel the weight of being prey, for these were Odin's wolves, and they fought with the cold precision of hunters. They did not charge headlong, teeth bared and eyes wild. Instead, they waited, crouched in the mist and under the branches of forests, moving with the silence of stalking predators. When the moment came, they struck not with chaos, but with deadly purpose. Their howls echoed across the battlefield, chilling spines before a blade had even been drawn. Then they descended, coordinated and swift, their spears flashing like the bite of fangs, their axes tearing through armour as though it were hide. To those who faced them, it was not a battle, but a hunt, and they were the quarry. The sagas tell of Ulfhednar bands who could pass through forests unseen, appearing suddenly in the midst of an enemy camp, with slaughter already in their hands. At night, their howls pierced the silence, confusion spreading like plague through villages and armies alike. Men would see shadows moving where none should be, hear whispers of movement beyond the firelight, and know in their hearts that death was watching them. For the wolf-coats were not merely fighters, they were fear-given form. They were bound to Odin, not through frenzy, but through the god's darker wisdom, his cunning and his hunger. In battle, they moved as packs, never breaking formation, circling their enemies as wolves circle a herd. Where berserkers struck like the hammer, Ulfhednar tore like the fang, one bite at the throat, another at the flank, until the enemy collapsed under the weight of fear and confusion. Their discipline was as frightening as their savagery. No wasted movement, no cries of madness, only the measured violence of predators who knew victory was already theirs. Those who survived to speak of them described eyes that glimmered with an unnatural light, steps too swift for mortal men, and voices that broke into wolfish howls at will. To face them was to lose not just the fight, but the will to fight at all. What shield wall could hold firm when every man in it felt the piercing gaze of a wolf upon him, waiting for the moment his guard fell? If the Berserkers were the storm that shattered armies, the Ulfhednar were the shadows that hollowed men's souls. They turned the battlefield into a hunting ground, and the warriors of Christendom into frightened prey. In them, the spirit of the wolf was not worn, it was lived. And wherever they passed, terror walked beside them. A Viking warrior was not forged in the clash of his first battle, but in the long years of trial that beat the softness from his flesh and carved steel into his spirit. From boyhood he was tested, shaped not by comfort but by hardship, for only through pain and cold could he be reborn as something beyond ordinary men. The sons of the north did not grow in gentle halls. They were thrown to the elements, raised where winter ruled, and taught that suffering was not an enemy but a teacher. It began with the body. Young boys were sent into icy rivers and forced to swim until their limbs numbed and their lungs burned. They learned to run barefoot over frost-hardened ground, their skin split and raw, until pain became nothing but a familiar companion. Some were made to sit naked in the snow, shivering under the gaze of elders who measured not strength of muscle but strength of will. To falter was shame, to endure was the first step toward greatness. Then came the trials of combat. Wooden swords struck bone until bruises blossomed across their bodies. Wrestling matches ended in broken noses and bloodied lips, yet still the boys were thrown back into the circle. They were taught to strike without hesitation, to take blows without complaint, to bleed without fear. By adolescence, their arms had grown uneven from endless weapon drills, bones thickened by strain, bodies moulded for war. But the flesh alone could not make them. The spirit too had to be reshaped. Alone in forests or atop mountains, they were sent into silence, left to wrestle not with men but with themselves. Some fasted for days, others endured sleepless nights beneath the stars, the howl of wolves echoing through the dark. In that solitude, they sought visions, calling on the spirits of beasts, on Odin himself, to guide them. It was in these trials that a boy first began to blur the line between man and animal, learning to feel the pulse of the wolf in his chest, or the strength of the bear in his limbs. Ritual crowned the training. Skins of beasts were draped across their shoulders, blood from sacrifices painted on their faces. They mimicked the growl of animals, the snapping of jaws, until they no longer played at transformation, but believed in it. To believe was to become, and in that belief, fear lost its hold. By the time a boy became a man, his flesh had been hardened, his spirit sharpened, his mind bound to a power greater than himself. Steel in his hand was merely the final piece. For when he stepped into battle, he carried not just a blade, but the endurance of pain, the calm of ritual, and the strength of beasts. This was how the North shaped its most terrifying warriors through flesh, spirit, and steel. To the men of the North, war was not only blood and steel, it was sacred. Every stroke of the axe, every howl on the battlefield, was part of a greater mystery. The most terrifying Viking warriors in history believed themselves not merely men, but vessels of the divine. They were Odin's chosen, bound to the All-Father through trance, sacrifice, and the spirits of beasts that walked beside them in battle. Odin was no gentle god. He was the one-eyed wanderer who traded an eye for wisdom, who hung 9 nights on the great tree to snatch the secrets of the runes, who drank deep from the well of death and ecstasy alike. To serve him was to step into shadow and madness, to court both knowledge and ruin. Warriors who swore themselves to Odin did not expect comfort. They sought transcendence, to leave behind the weakness of mortal flesh and take on something greater. Rituals opened the path. Some fasted until visions overtook them, their minds torn open by hunger and silence. Others inhaled the smoke of sacred herbs, letting the fire in their lungs carry them into the unseen. Drums beat like the pulse of the earth, chants rose into the night, and men swayed until they collapsed into trances where the barrier between man and God dissolved. In these moments, the warriors said, Odin entered them. His will became theirs, his hunger their own. The animal spirits followed. To wear the hide of the bear or wolf was not mere decoration, but a covenant. The pelt was a second skin, a bridge between worlds. By donning it, the warrior declared himself kin to the beast, ready to take its strength, its ferocity, its cunning. They mimicked the movements of animals in ritual, crawling on all fours, howling, growling, gnashing teeth, until the boundary blurred, and they no longer acted, but became. The bear's unstoppable might, the wolf's unyielding hunger, these were not costumes, they were transformations. On the battlefield, this possession was terror itself. Enemies swore they saw men's faces change, swelling and darkening as if beasts had seized them. Howls cut across the din of steel, not human cries, but the voices of wolves and bears. It was as though the wild itself had been unleashed. To Christian monks and foreign chroniclers, such warriors were demons. To their own kin, they were Odin's gifts, proof that the god of frenzy and wisdom still walked among them. Yet the price was steep. Few who gave themselves wholly to Odin returned unchanged. Their eyes grew distant, their tempers unbound, as if some part of them never left the trance. But in war, their presence was worth any cost. For to have Odin's chosen at your side was to fight with gods themselves, and to face them was to face the doom written in the sagas long before the first blow was struck. They said no iron could pierce them, no fire could burn them, and no fear could reach their hearts. But what gave the most terrifying Viking warriors in history such unearthly power? Some whispered it was Odin himself who filled their veins with frenzy. Others, speaking lower, told of strange plants and bitter brews that unlocked the storm within. For when the Berserkers howled and bit their shields until blood foamed at their mouths, it seemed more than mortal fury, it was madness shaped into a weapon. In the forests and meadows of the north grew the red-capped mushroom, speckled white like drops of frost. To those who knew its secrets, the fly agaric was no food, but a gate. Consumed in ritual, it could twist the mind, sharpen the senses, and swell the body with unnatural strength. Sweating, trembling, and wild-eyed, the warrior would feel pain slip from his flesh, leaving only the pounding of his heart and the roar of battle in his ears. To enemies who faced them, berserkers, under its spell seemed invincible, creatures who bled yet did not fall. Nor was the mushroom alone in its power. Henbane, with its bitter leaves, bog myrtle plucked from dark marshes, herbs steeped in mead until the drink itself carried visions, these too may have been weapons of the spirit. The sagas tell of warriors trembling as though seized by fever, then springing forward with the strength of bears and the hunger of wolves. Whether the cause was Odin's possession or the fire of herbs, who could tell? On the field, the effect was the same madness clad in steel. But the fury came at a price. When the battle ended, when the blood cooled, the warriors were left as husks. Some collapsed in weakness, their limbs shaking as if drained by unseen hands. Others sank into stupor, unable to rise from where they lay. The same herbs that had carried them beyond pain now left them hollow, spent, and vulnerable. It was the storm's aftermath silence, exhaustion, and the heavy toll of what it meant to wield such frenzy. Still, kings and chieftains welcomed these men into their warbands. For in the clash of shield and spear, the sight of berserkers, foam-flecked, painted, roaring like beasts, could break an enemy line before blades even crossed. Whether by gods or mushrooms, the terror they brought was real. Their madness was a weapon sharper than any axe, and its memory lingered longer than the scars it left. So the question remains, echoing from the sagas to the chronicles of their foes. Were the berserkers truly chosen of Odin, or were they men who found in blood and mushrooms the key to becoming more than human? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between. For on the battlefield, it mattered little what fueled their rage. What mattered was that no man who saw them ever forgot the horror of their charge. Before their axes ever rose, before their blades ever tasted blood, the most terrifying Viking warriors in history had already begun their battle. It was not fought first with steel, but with fear. Terror was their sharpest weapon, and they wielded it with as much skill as the edge of an axe. The berserkers and wolfcoats understood that to shatter the enemy's spirit was to win the fight before the first clash of shields. Picture the scene: a quiet dawn, a village guard staring into the mist. Then, from the fog, comes the sound low howls, bestial roars, the drumming of weapons against shields. Shapes appear, not men, but beasts draped in fur, their eyes burning wild. Some foam at the mouth, biting into their shields until wood splinters and blood mingles. Others grin with a wolf's calm hunger, watching as prey stiffens in dread. To face such a sight was to feel the marrow turn cold, to feel the heart falter before the body had even lifted its sword. The sagas speak often of armies breaking, not from wounds but from the sheer horror of what loomed before them. Shield walls that should have held firm instead crumbled as men dropped their spears and fled. What use was iron when the foe across the field seemed not of mortal flesh? How could courage stand when the enemy welcomed wounds with laughter, howled through broken bones, and fought as though death itself had no claim upon them? Foreign chroniclers recorded the same terror. In England, it was said the Northmen came like men possessed, eyes rolling, mouths twisted in madness. In Ireland, monks wrote of warriors who fought like wolves without reason. An Arab traveller described Norsemen howling like dogs before battle, shaking their spears and striking fear in all who heard. Even hardened soldiers, trained for war, found themselves trembling, for this was not the fury of men, it was the chaos of beasts given form. The psychological wound cut deeper than any blade. Once fear spread, it devoured all. A single cry of terror could ripple through an army until discipline broke. Men turned from the line, their backs exposed, and in that moment the berserkers struck, their frenzy scattering foes already half defeated. This was their true mastery, not merely in killing, but in unmaking the will to fight. And yet, it was not only their enemies who felt this dread. Even their allies sometimes looked upon them with unease, for to march beside such creatures was to wonder if one day their fury would turn upon friend as easily as foe. They were weapons loosed from the leash of reason, and the fear they sowed touched all who beheld them. Thus the terror in their eyes became legend, not simply because of the slaughter that followed, but because no man who gazed upon them could ever forget the feeling, that dreadful certainty, that he was no longer facing warriors, but nightmares made flesh. Among the sagas of the North, few names carry the weight of both awe and dread like Egil Skallagrimsson. He was not merely a warrior, nor simply a poet. He was both, a creature of blood and verse, as dangerous with his axe as with the words he carved into memory. To his enemies, he was terror given flesh. To his kin, he was a storm they could never fully command. And to the skalds who followed, he was proof that the most terrifying Viking warriors in history were not always the loudest berserkers, but the ones who mixed fury with cunning. From his earliest years, Egil bore the mark of violence. At only 7 winters old, he struck down another boy with an axe during a game turned sour. His mother, far from chastising him, praised him, declaring that such ferocity showed the makings of a true Viking. Blood was his first song, and it would echo through every step of his life. His father, Skallagrim, himself prone to berserker rages, passed the fire into his son's veins, and from then on, Egil's fury was never far from the surface. But Egil was no mindless beast. When the rage swelled, his face darkened, his brows sank low, and his eyes grew as cold as winter seas. Yet within that storm, his mind remained sharp. He fought like a berserker, unstoppable and unflinching, but he thought like a poet, weaving strategy into slaughter. At the great battle of Brunanburh, he carved his way through enemies with such ferocity that even hardened warriors faltered before him. Yet when the fighting ended, he turned to verse, composing poetry that immortalized his own deeds and those of his kin. His words struck as deep as his blade, leaving both fear and admiration in their wake. This was what made Egil so dangerous, his unpredictability. He could be ally or scourge, depending only on his mood and honor. Kings sought him for his strength, yet trembled when his temper flared. Once, he stood before King Eric Bloodaxe, condemned and facing death. But instead of begging for mercy, Egil recited a praise poem so powerful that even the king, who hated him deeply, could not bring himself to order the execution. Such was Egil's gift, to wield words as weapons sharper than iron. He lived long by Viking measure, well into his 80s, his body twisted, but his spirit unbroken. In his final years, blind and weakened, he still commanded fear. Tales tell that he buried treasure on a lonely hillside, killing the slaves who helped him so that none could betray the secret. It was the last act of a man who lived by his own code, savage and poetic until the end. Egil Skallagrimsson was more than a warrior or a poet. He was both storm and song, a living paradox whose fury could topple armies and whose verses could outlive kings. To face him in battle was terror. To hear his poetry was to know that terror would never be forgotten. He stood taller than most men by a head, broad as the oaken beams that held up long halls, his shadow enough to make lesser warriors falter. Thorkel the Tall was his name, and his presence alone was enough to turn the tide of a battlefield. Yet his height was not the most fearsome thing about him. What made Thorkel one of the most terrifying Viking warriors in history was the iron discipline he commanded, for he was not only a champion in single combat, but the leader of the Jomsvikings, an elite brotherhood, whose code was as unyielding as steel. The Jomsvikings were no common raiders. They lived by law and oath, answering to no king but their own strict order. They accepted only the fiercest, demanding that every man prove himself through trials of combat. Cowards were cast out, oath-breakers slain without mercy. They feared nothing, not gods, not kings, not death itself. And at their head stood Thorkel, the towering commander whose voice could still an army, and whose axe could cleave a shield wall in two. When he led them into England in the early years of the 11th century, it was not as scattered pirates, but as an army, a host that marched with purpose. Villages burned, silver was heaped high, and kings bent beneath the weight of his campaign. At Canterbury, he seized the city, and with it the archbishop himself, a prize worth more than gold. Chronicles tell how Thorkel, unlike his men, tried to spare the holy man's life, offering wealth to protect him. Yet, when his drunken warriors slew the archbishop despite his command, Thorkel turned his fury not upon the English, but upon his own. He abandoned part of his fleet, breaking with those who had defied him, and swore service to the very king he had just raided. This was Thorkel's true terror. His loyalty was to none but his own will. One day he was scourge, the next a shield. He bent kingdoms to his purpose, shifting like the tide, but always advancing his power. To fight against him was to face not only a warrior of monstrous strength, but a commander whose strategy was as sharp as his blade. His enemies never knew if they faced berserker fury or calculated order, for he wielded both with equal mastery. The English feared him, the Danes respected him, and his Jomsvikings followed him with a devotion born not of love but of awe. He was Thorkel the Tall, whose size made him seem a giant, whose cunning made him untouchable, and whose name carried terror from the Baltic to the western seas. To stand across the field from him was to face not just one man, but the disciplined fury of wolves bound together under a master. And when he raised his axe, the question was never who would die, but how many. He was called Hardrada, the hard ruler, and his very name carried the weight of steel and storm. Harold Sigurdsson, half-brother of Saint Olaf, was no ordinary warrior. He was a man who carved his path across continents, from the snows of Norway to the gilded palaces of Byzantium, from the deserts of the Holy Land to the green fields of England. In every land he set foot, he left behind tales of his ferocity, his cunning, and his relentless hunger for power. Of all the most terrifying Viking warriors in history, few matched the breadth of his legend. At 15 winters, Harold fought at the Battle of Stiklestad beside his brother Olaf. Though the battle ended in defeat and Olaf lay slain, the boy's valour was already spoken of in hushed awe. Wounded but unbroken, he fled east, carrying the fire of vengeance in his heart. That fire would not dim, it would grow, until Harold rose to command the Varangian Guard in Constantinople, the emperor's own shield and sword. There, clad in Byzantine mail, wielding the long axe of the north, he fought in wars far from home, against Saracens in Sicily, rebels in the Balkans, and enemies who had never before heard the word Viking. Chronicles tell how Harold's tactics were as feared as his strength. He set cities aflame with cunning tricks, loosing fire-bearing birds into rafters so that whole strongholds burned from within. But Harold was not merely a servant of emperors. He grew rich in Constantinople, richer than any king in the north, and with that wealth he returned home. When at last he took the throne of Norway, he ruled with an iron hand, earning the name Hardrada. He raised a fleet that stretched across the seas, forged the first standing army his people had ever known, and struck terror into all who defied him. For 2 decades, he waged war against Denmark, unyielding, tireless, always pressing for more. To his enemies, he was not a king, but a wolf with a crown. Yet it was in England that Harold's fate reached its fiercest blaze. In the year 1066, he sailed west with near 300 ships and thousands of warriors at his back. Towns fell swiftly, lords bent their knees, and his banners of the raven spread across the land. At Fulford, his forces crushed the English, the earth running black with blood beneath their axes. But glory is a fickle friend. At Stamford Bridge, King Harold Godwinson struck north with sudden speed, and there Harold met his end. They say he fought like a god that day, wielding his great 2-handed axe with such fury that men fell as wheat beneath the scythe. Even pierced through the throat with an arrow, he stood long enough to strike again, unbending until death dragged him down. Thus ended Harold Hardrada, the last great Viking conqueror, a warrior king whose shadow stretched from Byzantium to Britain, He died, as he had lived in fire, in steel, and in terror. They were not bound by blood, nor by king, nor by land. The Jomsvikings were a breed apart, a brotherhood forged not in kinship but in oath. To join their ranks was to surrender the life of ordinary men and embrace a code as cold and sharp as iron. They called no kingdom home, no ruler master, yet princes and lords across Europe bent their will to secure their service. For when the Jomsvikings marched, they carried with them the fear of all who had heard their name whispered in dread. Their fortress of Jomsborg rose upon the southern Baltic, a stronghold where only the chosen might dwell. There, in the shadow of high walls and the roar of the sea, men were tested as beasts are tested, through trial by combat, through endurance of pain, through unyielding obedience. No coward could stand among them, no oath-breaker survived their judgment. Their laws were merciless: never flee before an equal foe, never show fear, never disobey the Brotherhood's commands. Any man who faltered was cut down by his own comrades, for the code was sacred and the code was all. In return for this iron discipline, they gained power beyond reckoning. They fought not for plunder alone, but for contracts, their swords sold to kings, jarls, and foreign princes alike. With their strength, thrones were won, crowns secured, borders redrawn. One year they might serve Denmark, the next turn their axes upon it. Loyalty was not theirs to give, it belonged only to the code. This made them dangerous beyond measure, for no bond of kin or kingdom restrained them, only the Brotherhood's iron law. On the battlefield, their discipline was as frightening as their ferocity. While other Viking bands broke into wild charges, the Jomsvikings held the line, their shield wall locked tight, advancing as one body. Behind that wall, axes rose and fell with mechanical precision, carving through foes like the relentless pounding of waves. When they charged together, a wall of steel that crushed anything in its path. Enemies knew that to face them was not to fight mere raiders, but a war machine honed by oath and bound in fearsome unity. Yet their strength was also their doom. Chronicles tell of battles where their code drove them into hopeless fights, refusing retreat even when death was certain. At Hjörungavágr, they faced the forces of Norway and fell by the hundreds, refusing to yield, though storm and steel tore them apart. But even in defeat, their legend grew. For who could forget warriors who laughed at death, who stood unbroken until the last, who lived and died by a code harsher than any king's decree? The Jomsvikings were mercenaries, yes, but they were more than that. They were a vision of what terror becomes when forged into order. Not wild wolves, not mindless berserkers, but a brotherhood of steel whose contracts reshaped kingdoms and whose code outlived even their fortress on the sea. The night was never silent when the wolf warriors stalked. Long before steel struck flesh, their howls carried on the wind, low and mournful at first, then rising to a frenzy that turned men's hearts to water. The Ulfhednar, Odin's wolfcoats, moved like shadows, their pelts drawn over shoulders, their faces hidden beneath snarling jaws of beasts. Where berserkers shattered shield walls with madness, these warriors hunted with patience, cunning, and the cold terror of the night. Villages on the edge of forests feared them most. The first sign was often nothing but silence. Dogs refusing to bark, livestock restless in their pens, a sense that the world itself held its breath. Then came the sound, a lone howl, answered by another, and then another, until the dark throbbed with the voices of wolves. Men rushed for their weapons, yet their hands shook, for these were not beasts of the wild. These were men turned wolf, trained to strike when fear had already hollowed the heart. They fell upon their prey without warning. Silent feet carried them through thickets and across fields, their bodies low, their movements swift and coordinated. One moment the night was still, the next it erupted with screams as fire lit the sky. The Ulfhednar struck with precision, cutting down guards before an alarm could spread, seizing doorways and dragging men from their homes. To fight them was to be struck from all sides at once, the hunters already within the walls before a shield could be raised. Chroniclers tell of men who swore the wolves became more than flesh in these raids. They claimed to see eyes glowing in the dark, jaws snapping where no beast stood, warriors who seemed to vanish into the trees, only to reappear behind their foes. Whether truth or fear's illusion, it mattered little, for the effect was the same. Armies broke, villages burned, and across the night carried the sound of howling, a chorus that seemed to mock the cries of the dying. The terror lingered long after the Ulfhednar were gone. Survivors told tales that spread from hall to hall, each retelling heavier with dread than the last. To peasants and priests alike, they were not men but demons in wolfskins, Odin's hunters loosed upon Christendom. Even hardened warriors learned to dread the night when howls echoed too close. It was not the thought of death alone, but the certainty that death would come unseen, sudden and merciless, as it comes to the prey of wolves. Thus the Ulfhednar carved their legend not by the daylight clash of armies, but in the midnight hunts where men's courage withered and villages fell to silence. They were the shadows in the trees, the red eyes in the dark, the reason the night belonged not to men but to wolves. The battlefield trembled not only from the clash of steel, but from the sight of men transformed into something monstrous. The most terrifying Viking warriors in history bore marks that set them apart from mortal fighters, and none were more feared than those seized by the shield-biting curse. To see it was to witness madness with one's own eyes, warriors foaming at the mouth, jaws clamped upon the iron rim of their shields until teeth cracked and blood ran down their chins. Chroniclers tell us of armies freezing at the sight. Imagine it, lines of men holding their ground, the mist hanging low, and then before them, figures shaking with frenzy, their eyes rolling back, their faces swollen and red. With a sudden cry, they bit into their shields, gnashing wood and iron as though devouring the very tools of war. Their bodies shuddered, yet they did not falter. They spat blood, howled like beasts, and hurled themselves forward with strength that defied reason. To their foes, it was as if they faced creatures possessed by demons. The sagas remember these moments with awe. Snorri himself wrote of Odin's chosen, who gnawed their shields and grew strong as bears, untouchable by fire or steel. To those who stood across from them, the madness was worse than wounds. For how could any man fight an enemy who welcomed pain and fed upon fear? Even before the first blow was struck, courage drained from their foes, their lines breaking at the sight of men who seemed already half dead, half divine. Some believed the shield-biting was a ritual, the gateway to the Berserker fury. By sinking their teeth into iron, they crossed the threshold from man into beast. The act drew blood, yes, but it also drew terror. To watch a warrior grind his own mouth to ruin and rise, smiling, lips foaming, was to believe him beyond human frailty. Enemies often swore such men struck harder than 10, tore through shield walls as if they were reeds, and endured wounds that should have brought instant death. Yet there was a cost. Those who bore the curse often collapsed when the frenzy fled, their strength drained, their faces twisted with the toll of what they had endured. Still, the memory of their fury lingered. Monks wrote of it in horror, foreign travellers spoke of it with dread, and the Norse themselves sang of it with pride. The shield-biting curse became the mark of the Berserker, proof that he had cast aside the last remnants of human restraint. To see it was to lose hope. To hear the crack of teeth on iron, the guttural growls that followed, was to know that the battle had already been decided. For in that moment, men ceased to fight as men, and rose as monsters, and the world around them broke in terror. The sagas told of men who wore the hides of beasts, who howled like wolves, and struck with the strength of bears. For centuries, some doubted their truth, thinking them mere tales to frighten or inspire. Yet the earth does not lie. Beneath barrows and cairns, beneath the dark soil of the north, the bones and the blades of these warriors have been uncovered. whispering that the most terrifying Viking warriors in history were not born of myth alone. In Sweden, the Torslanda plates depict warriors clad in bearskins, their heads crowned with snarling jaws, dancing in ritual fury. The carvings are no idle ornament, they are testimony, stamped into bronze by hands that knew what they had seen. In Gotland, stones carved with wolves and armed men speak the same truth, that the Ulfhednar walked among them, feared and revered in equal measure. These were not stories told in smoky halls alone. They were part of the living world, etched into the memory of stone and metal. The graves tell still more. At Berka, a man was laid to rest not only with sword and axe, but with bear claws arranged at his side, as though he had gone into the next world wearing the skin of the beast. Elsewhere, wolf teeth and bones have been found mingled with warrior burials, their placement too deliberate to be dismissed as chance. These were not charms or trinkets. They were symbols of transformation, the proof that the fallen had lived as more than men. Weapons, too, bear their mark. Axes larger than common hands could wield with ease, their weight demanding unnatural strength. Shields hardened not with iron alone, but with the bite marks of their owners, scored deep into the wood as if to carry into death the memory of the fury that once seized them. Some swords were bent in burial, a ritual killing of the blade, as though the weapon itself had been alive, bound to the spirit of the warrior who carried it. The bones themselves tell stories no saga could invent. Skeletons scarred with wounds survived, fractures healed that should have ended lives, skulls thickened from the blows of war. These men endured what should have slain them, their bodies bearing the marks of a lifetime of violence. Their very bones echo the legends that they fought beyond human limits, that they survived what others could not. Together, the evidence rises like a chorus from the earth. Bear pelts in graves, wolf bones scattered with steel, carvings of men half beast, half human. Legends given flesh, myths given proof. The sagas spoke, and the ground has answered. The Berserkers and Ulfhednar were real. Their fury was not a poet's fancy, but a terror that walked upon the earth, leaving behind bones and blades that even in death cry out the truth of what they were. The terror of the North was not spoken of only in sagas sung by their own people. Across distant lands, where foreign monks dipped quills in trembling hands and travellers recorded the wonders and horrors they had seen, the tales of Viking warriors spread like wildfire. From the coasts of England to the green hills of Ireland, from the courts of the Franks to the rivers of the East, they wrote of men who fought like demons, possessed not by courage alone, but by something darker, something that stripped them of their humanity. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, carved in the ink of dread, described them as wolves among sheep, striking suddenly and vanishing like smoke. Whole monasteries stood in ruin, monks slain at their altars, and yet what lingered strongest was not only the death, but the memory of those faces contorted in fury, eyes bulging, mouths foaming, bodies heedless of wounds. The English had seen war before, but never men who seemed impervious to the very nature of death. In Ireland, where the Northmen carved their way through kingdoms with axe and fire, the annals painted them in words steeped with horror. Chroniclers wrote of invaders who descended upon villages like storms, shrieking as though possessed, breaking men not only with steel, but with the sight of their madness. They were called men who had lost their wits, beings stripped of reason, whose cries echoed longer in memory than the clash of battle itself. The Irish came to see them not as foes of flesh and blood, but as curses sent upon them, scourges in human form. Even beyond Christendom, their fame or their infamy spread. On the Volga, the Arab diplomat Ahmad ibn Fadlan wrote of the Rus, Norsemen who traded and raided along the great rivers. He described them as towering figures, fierce as the beasts whose pelts they wore. When they prepared for war, he heard their howls, saw them strike their shields with teeth and hands until frenzy took them. To his eyes, they were like men seized by spirits, their courage so reckless it bordered on madness. They flung themselves into battle without care for life, and when blood flowed, it only seemed to drive them deeper into their fury. To Ibn Fadlan, these men were not merely warriors, but creatures ruled by something primal and merciless. Such accounts, drawn from voices who had no cause to glorify them, give weight to the terror the Vikings carried. They were remembered not for discipline, nor for order, but for the raw force of dread they embodied. To foreigners, they were not men but demons clothed in fur and steel, the embodiment of nightmares made flesh. And so their reputation grew, not by their own boast alone, but by the fearful whispers of all who survived them, proof that terror itself was their greatest conquest. The fury that made the Berserkers the most terrifying Viking warriors in history was no gift freely given. It came with a price, one that bled them long after the battle drums had fallen silent. To watch them in their frenzy was to see gods of war unleashed foaming mouths, eyes alight with madness, wounds ignored as though the flesh no longer bound them. But when the storm passed, when the last foe lay dead or fled, those same warriors often fell as if struck by unseen blows. The rage that carried them beyond mortal limits drained from their bodies, leaving only weakness in its place. The sagas speak of it often. A berserker would fight with the strength of 10, uprooting trees, shattering shield walls, striking down men as though they were straw. Yet once the fit ended, he could barely lift his own limbs. Some collapsed into exhaustion, trembling as if seized by sickness, unable even to stand. Others fell into deep, death-like sleep, vulnerable as children. To have such warriors at one's side was both a boon and a peril, indomitable in battle, but helpless when the fury fled. Worse still was the danger when the madness failed to heed command. There are tales of berserkers who, unable to master their rage, turned their fury on friend as easily as foe. In halls where ale flowed and tempers flared, a sudden fit could see comrades slain, their deaths meaningless beneath the teeth and axes of men who no longer knew reason. Kings and jarls welcomed their might, but many kept them at a distance, wary of what might happen should their frenzy strike at the wrong moment. This curse of uncontrollable rage etched fear even into their own kind. Laws in Iceland condemned the berserker gang, naming it outlawry to fall into such a state, for too many had been killed not in battle, but in feasts and quarrels when the fury struck unbidden. The very gift that made them gods of war made them also monsters at home, unpredictable and dangerous. And then there was the toll upon the body and spirit. Shield-biting left teeth shattered, endless strain left bones warped, muscles torn, faces swollen with blood. Some lived long enough to carry their scars into old age, but more often they burned out like fire consuming its own fuel, their strength gone before their years. Behind the legend of invincibility lay men broken by their own power, drained by the very frenzy that had lifted them above mortals. To face a berserker in battle was terror, to live as one was torment. Their glory was bought with pain, their strength with weakness, their triumph with the constant shadow of collapse. This was the true price of fury, that the very fire which made them invincible also consumed them, leaving behind not only fear in their enemies, but ruin in themselves. The terror of the berserkers could not last forever, for as fear of them spread across Europe, so too did the faith that would one day smother their fire. When the cross took root in the north, it brought not only a new god, but a new order, one that had no place for Odin's chosen. The most terrifying Viking warriors in history, once hailed as living weapons, soon found themselves hunted not by swords alone, but by law, by faith, and by the changing tide of their own people. The church looked upon the berserkers and saw not warriors but demons. Their shield-biting frenzy, their howls and foaming mouths, were branded signs of possession, not divine gift. Where the Norse had seen Odin's hand, priests saw the devil's work. The rites that bound man to beast the pelts, the chants, the sacrifices, were condemned as witchcraft, dangerous relics of a dying faith. To cleanse the land, churches rose where once sacred groves stood, and holy men raised their voices against the wolf and bear warriors who had long been honoured. But it was not only priests who struck them down. Kings too found cause to end the Berserkers' reign. In Iceland's law code, the Berserker gang was outlawed. If a man gave himself to the fury, he was branded a criminal, stripped of protection, hunted like a beast. Elsewhere, similar decrees spread no longer heroes. These warriors were declared threats to the peace. Their glory turned to shame in the eyes of their people. Saga writers too, once praising their valour, began to twist their image. Where early tales showed them as champions, later ones cast them as villains, unruly killers, dangerous drunkards, foils to noble kings who brought law and faith to the land. What had once been awe became warning, their memory reshaped to fit a world no longer willing to bear them. The transformation was not swift. For a time, the old ways lingered. Wolfskins still appeared in graves, bear claws still clutched in skeletal hands, but as generations passed, the wildness faded. The church not only destroyed their shrines and outlawed their rituals, it claimed the very souls of their descendants. To speak proudly of Odin's warriors was to invite accusation. To train in their ways was to risk death. Slowly, systematically, they were erased not only from the battlefield, but from the very fabric of memory. And so the fire dimmed. The Berserkers who had once broken shield walls with their frenzy were broken in turn by faith, by law, and by time. Their howls were silenced, their rites abandoned, their fury remembered not as glory but as sin. The church struck back, and in doing so ended an age. What remained were only echoes, sagas reshaped, and bones buried deep in the earth, silent reminders of a terror once unleashed, and a world that chose to bury it. In the oldest tales, the Berserker was sung as a hero, a chosen of Odin whose fury could break armies and bend the fate of kings. His madness was not shame but glory, proof that he had transcended the bounds of mortal flesh. Yet as the centuries turned and the cross cast its shadow across the north, the sagas began to tell a different story. What was once divine became demonic. What was once awe-inspiring became monstrous. The most terrifying Viking warriors in history, who had once stood as champions, were reshaped into villains. The earliest skalds praised them as the spear point of the gods' will men, who howled like wolves, who fought like bears, who carried the terror of Odin into battle. Kings kept them close, jarls boasted of their service, and their names were woven into verses as proof of divine favour. To see a berserker at one's side was to feel invincible. To see one charging against you was to know doom. They were larger than life, feared but also revered, their fury written into the very fabric of Norse pride. But when the new faith spread, the memory of such men became troublesome. A Christian world had no place for warriors who claimed possession by pagan gods, who howled and foamed like beasts, who killed without reason when the frenzy struck. Slowly, the sagas began to twist their image. Instead of loyal champions, berserkers appeared as marauders, bullies, and threats to order. They were written not as heroes but as obstacles, villains who had to be slain by noble Christian heroes to restore peace. In Grettir's saga, they are brutish foes, slain to prove the hero's worth. In Hrolf Kraki's tale, they appear as savage, uncontrollable men whose madness endangers friend as much as foe. Where once shield-biting had been a mark of holy fury, it became the symbol of demonic frenzy, a curse that branded the warrior as unclean. Their howls, once cries of power, were rewritten as madness. Their strength, once admired, was recast as danger. This transformation was not only the work of scribes, but the reflection of a society that had changed, kings now ruled by law rather than fear. The church demanded order, obedience, and faith in God, not in the frenzy of Odin. To keep alive the memory of berserkers as heroes was to defy the new order, so their legend was broken and reforged into a warning. They became examples of what must be overcome, reminders of a wild, pagan past that no longer had a place in the halls of power. And so the Berserker passed from hero to villain, from chosen to cursed. Yet the very act of demonizing them ensured their survival in memory. For though the sagas condemned them, they could not erase the terror they inspired. Even as villains, the Berserkers remained unforgettable men who walked the edge between man and beast, whose shadow loomed long after their age had ended. There was a time when the charge of a single Berserker could shatter a line of spears, when the howl of wolf warriors in the night was enough to send whole villages fleeing. Yet no storm lasts forever. The most terrifying Viking warriors in history, once the terror of Europe, began to fade, not because they grew weaker, but because the world around them changed. The age of the beast warriors ended not in one great battle, but slowly, as the shape of war itself turned against them. The Berserkers had thrived in a world of sudden raids, where the clash of ships on distant shores and the breaking of shield walls decided victory. In such chaos, their madness was unmatched. To feel no pain, to strike with fury that ignored wounds, to terrify before steel even met, this made them kings of the battlefield. The Ulfhednar, too, found their place in the shadows, slipping through forests, striking with cunning ambushes, their wolf pelts marking them as hunters of men. But as armies grew larger, as rulers forged kingdoms from scattered lands, war demanded something more than frenzy and cunning. It demanded order. Shield walls became tighter, formations deeper, and discipline the true measure of victory. Against ranks of spearmen who held their ground, the lone charge of a berserker was no longer a storm, but a sacrifice. Arrows rained from afar, cavalry thundered in, and the madness that once carried them through fire and steel now left them exposed, cut down before they could close the distance. Their terror still had power, but less so against foes who fought not with fear, but with drilled obedience. The kings who once prized them began to favour standing armies, warriors trained not to howl like beasts, but to hold a line, to march in step, to obey. Mercenaries fought for coin, not gods. Knights rose in the west, armoured and disciplined, their steeds carrying them through the fury of men on foot. Even in the north, the old warrior cults weakened, their rituals outlawed, their sacred groves razed. A new order demanded warriors who fought as one body, not wild men who raged beyond command. And so, one by one, the beast warriors vanished. Their numbers dwindled, their rights forgotten, their memory reshaped into stories of villains and outlaws rather than champions. What had once been the pride of Odin's chosen became shame, their fury condemned by law, their madness no longer a weapon but a curse. By the 13th century, their howls no longer echoed across the fields of battle, the shield biting, the wolf howls, the storm of frenzy, all of it passed into silence. Yet in that silence, their shadow remained. For though formations and discipline triumphed, no tale of battle could forget the men who fought like beasts, who charged beyond pain and reason. The end of the Berserkers and Ulfhednar was the end of an age, but their memory still lingers, a reminder of the time when terror itself was a weapon, and warriors became more than men. Across the wide sweep of the world, there have always been men who stepped beyond the bounds of fear, who stood as living weapons in the service of their gods, their kings, or their people. The North remembers the Berserkers and the Ulfhednar, the most terrifying Viking warriors in history, men who howled like wolves and fought as if death itself could not touch them. Yet they were not alone. In distant lands, other brotherhoods of terror arose, each bound by their own laws of steel and spirit, and though oceans and ages divided them, they shared the same dreadful gift, the ability to cast aside fear. To the south, under the burning sun, the Aztec eagle and jaguar warriors strode into battle, clothed in feathered splendour, their bodies painted with the likeness of the beasts they became. For them, war was more than conquest. It was the hunt for captives, the spilling of blood to feed their gods. Their terror lay not only in their skill, but in the fate they promised their enemies sacrifice upon the stone, hearts torn still beating from the chest. Like the Berserkers, They blurred the line between man and beast, their very image meant to unnerve, their cries echoing like predators in the field. Far to the east, across seas and mountains, the samurai carried another kind of dread. They did not howl or foam, nor did they don the skins of wolves, but their terror came from their unbreakable code. To face a samurai was to face a man who embraced death before the battle began, who held his life so lightly that nothing could make him falter. Their blades were not only weapons, but symbols of an honor that demanded perfection. Where the berserker, terrified by madness, the samurai chilled by calm, by the certainty that he would cut you down without hesitation or doubt. And in the rocky valleys of Greece, long before the Northmen raided Lindisfarne, the Spartans had already shown the world what men without fear could achieve. Trained from boyhood in hardship and cruelty, they lived only for war, and at Thermopylae 300 of them stood against an empire, unyielding even as death closed upon them. Their terror was not in wild rage, nor in divine trance, but in their unshakable wall of discipline. To see them advance was to see a living machine, iron-willed, impossible to break. Each of these traditions, Aztec, Samurai, Spartan, Viking, wore different faces, but behind them lay the same truth. The weapon most feared on the battlefield is not the sword or spear, but the man who feels no fear of death. The berserker foamed with fury, the samurai stood serene, the Spartan held the line, the eagle warrior hunted men for sacrifice. Different in ritual, alike in dread, they carved their names into history as reminders that the most terrifying enemy is not the one who stands before you, but the one who will not yield even when the world crumbles around him. The sagas spoke of men who fought as if fire burned in their veins, who bit their shields, howled like beasts, and felt no wound until the fury ebbed. To their enemies, these were no mere warriors, but demons loosed upon the earth. Yet behind the terror of the most terrifying Viking warriors in history lay a truth that the skalds could not name, though they felt its power. The strange alchemy of the mind and body that turned men into something more than human. When a berserker's eyes rolled white and his chest thundered with bestial cries, what stirred within him was not only faith in Odin, nor the bite of herbs and mushrooms, but the awakening of a deeper force. The body, driven to its edge, can unlock reserves that lie hidden in every man but rarely seen. Blood surges, the heart becomes a war drum, and pain itself is dulled, drowned in a tide of battle madness. Today one might call it frenzy, but in their time it was possession, the spirit of the bear or wolf filling the warrior's flesh. The trance of the berserker was not unlike the rapture of the seeress or the shaman. Breath quickened, vision narrowed, and the world became a tunnel of steel and fury. With every heartbeat, the warrior stepped further from the realm of men and deeper into the realm of beasts. Blades that would cripple another man seemed to strike no deeper than scratches. Fire could not drive them back, nor arrows pierce their charge, for the mind, unchained from fear, drove the body far beyond its limits. But the gift came at a cost. The same power that carried them through walls of shields left them shattered when it passed. Like a storm, the rage burned hot, then died, leaving the berserker weak, trembling, sometimes half blind and broken. It was as if the soul itself had been scorched in the fire of battle. Many feared their own comrades once the fury was spent, for a berserker could turn his strength upon friend as easily as foe if the haze had not yet lifted. What the ancients called magic, we now glimpse as the hidden workings of flesh and spirit, the body's surge of strength when death looms near, the mind's power to silence pain and fear. But to the men who stood before them, none of this mattered. To them, these were not men caught in frenzy, but monsters clothed in human skin, the chosen of Odin, the beasts of battle. And perhaps that is the truest science of their rage, that terror itself was their weapon. Whether born of gods, herbs, or hidden fires of the mind, the sight of a berserker in full fury could unmake the courage of armies. Their rage was more than madness. It was a force that bent the battlefield to their will, shaping legends that even now refuse to die. The tales of the most terrifying Viking warriors in history did not end when the last berserker fell silent. Though the howl of the wolf warriors faded, their shadow remained, echoing through song, saga, and story, until it became part of the memory of mankind itself. For even when the church forbade their fury, and the shield-biting trance was cursed as devilry, the image of the berserker endured a figure of awe and dread, half man, half beast, unbreakable in the storm of battle. Skalds wove their names into sagas, preserving their madness as both warning and inspiration. Generations repeated tales of men who could not be slain, whose eyes burned with otherworldly fire, who struck fear so deep into their foes that armies crumbled before the fight began. Over time, these stories crossed borders. Kings and warriors far from the north heard of men who fought without fear, and the very word berserk carried a weight of chaos and terror that still lingers in the tongue. Yet the legacy was not only in words. Their spirits seeped into the marrow of warfare itself. In ages to come, long after Odin's worship faded, men sought to awaken that same iron will and frenzy in their soldiers. The harsh rites of training, the stripping away of fear, the moulding of men into weapons who could endure cold, pain, and hunger. These were echoes of the Old North. A warrior who charges without thought of death, who uses fury not as weakness but as strength, walks in the path carved by the berserker. Even among the fiercest orders of later times, the guards of emperors, the shock troops of kings, the silent killers of shadow, there is something of the berserker's spirit. A belief that fear can be drowned, that the mind can be sharpened to ignore pain, that men can step beyond the limits of flesh, if only they surrender to a higher cause. The berserkers used gods and beasts to break their chains, but the lesson they left is one that warriors through every age have sought to master. Courage without limits is more fearsome than the sharpest steel. Still, their memory is not one of discipline and order, but of raw power, unbridled and unchained. That is why the image of the berserker endures not as a soldier in line, but as a storm loosed from its bonds. In literature and legend, they rise again, figures who fight like fire, given form, who carry the wild strength of beasts, who embody the terror of men who will not fall. And so, the legacy of the berserker lives on not only in the sagas of the North, but in every whisper of the fearless, in every warrior who takes the field believing he cannot die. The fury of those men, long buried, still burns, reminding us that the line between man and monster is thinner than we dare to believe. In the end, when the sagas fall silent and the smoke of battle drifts away, one question lingers like a shadow across the ages. What truly were the most terrifying Viking warriors in history? Were the berserkers demons cloaked in human skin, cursed by gods to tear through the world with unholy rage? Were they heroes, exalted by Odin himself, living proof that a man could rise above the chains of fear and stride into death as if it were a feast? Or were they simply men flesh and blood, like any other who found a way to reach the farthest edge of human strength, and in doing so, frightened the world into legend? The shadow that remains of them is not only in bones and graves, nor in sagas scratched upon vellum. It lingers in the silence before battle, when warriors steel themselves and wonder whether fear will claim them. It lingers in the sight of men who cast aside all thought of survival and charge, as though Odin's hand is at their back. And it lingers in the whispers of villagers who swore they saw men bite iron, howl like wolves, and fight on with spears driven through their flesh. To some, they were monsters proof that man could become beast when he abandoned the bonds of kinship and reason. To others, they were the chosen of the gods, touched by a power that lesser men could neither summon nor withstand. But perhaps the truth is more unsettling still. They were men, yet they walked upon the knife's edge of humanity, where flesh, spirit, and fury blur into something that defies understanding. Their legacy is not comfort, but unease. They remind us that within every man lies a fire, and under the right hand of faith, frenzy, or desperation, that fire can burn away all fear, all pain, all weakness. Whether that fire makes a hero or a monster depends only on who beholds it. And so the Berserker remains not just a figure of the past, but a mirror of the extremes we carry still. A reminder that the line between man and beast, warrior and monster, saint and demon, is as thin as the edge of a sword. The sagas tell us their names, but the shadow they cast is larger than any man. Even now, the question remains unanswered, and perhaps it always will. Were the Berserkers of old Odin's fury given flesh, or were they simply proof of what man becomes when he dares to break every chain?